A group of Britain's most senior lawyers and lords have co-signed a letter criticising the change in law making this possible. It's a very technical change to try to keep up with a ruling by the Northern Ireland High Court last year. One of the critics is the former chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life, something we've talked about a lot in the past 24 hours, Lord Bew, and we can speak to him now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
This is fairly technical. So I was just wondering whether you can, in the simplest possible terms for our listeners, just explain. This is all about amending the Legacy Act.
Yes, it is difficult to explain, but I'll try. The Legacy Act of the last government is now in doubt of significant parts because we have a new government. The last government had included a provision in which it protected what it saw as the age-old principle, since 1943, Cartona principle in the British government, in terms of how you could, in an emergency, have, for example, a junior minister sign a key order rather than a senior minister. It's on that basis that the ruling in favour of the High Court has been made in Belfast. There's been a tendency for the courts to say, because only junior ministers signed interment orders in the terrible circumstances of the 70s, these are, in a sense, not really properly legitimate,
right,
and the payments have to be made. We are talking. The future budget for Legacy in Northern Ireland is billions, I should say, or should be probably billions. Some of it unavoidable. Sir Declan Morgan's important ICR commission will be expensive, but not all of it is unavoidable. And the great British taxpayer is the unknown hero of the Troubles, which kept this place stable for decades. I don't think he should be made a joke of now.
Right. What else can the government do? Because they say that the High Court ruled that parts of the Legacy Act were incompatible with the ECHR. So there's that to get passed. And then also They say that they repealed parts of it of the Act that meant that certain individuals had immunity from prosecution. So it's a kind of double-edged thing.
Well, first of all, there's the question of what Labour said in opposition. And while they had perfectly understandable criticisms of the Act, some of which they're now going to act on in power, they are not, for example, removing its central institution, the ICRIR, under Sir Declan Morgan, and they have an option as to what else they act on and what they don't act on. And they haven't. This government is not always lost in admiration, as far as one can see, for the High Court in Belfast. So this is a choice, a quite definite choice, potentially an expensive choice. And if you want to know why I personally became so uneasy about it, during COVID, I watched the Constitution Committee of the Lords, and the President of the Supreme Court, Lord Reid, was being questioned by senior peers, and Lord Howell, then a junior minister, raised this issue, and it was quite clear that Lord Reid, who was unwilling to defend the idea that people should receive compensation who had been interned and then escaped and so on, when the forms had only been signed for their internment by a junior minister, because Lord Howell was explaining, as a then junior minister, how messy and incredibly complex the situation was in Belfast. And it was when I watched the expression of Lord Reid's face, the uneasy expression on his face, that I began to realise that there is actually a problem here.
Right.
And at the moment, Parliament is sovereign. Parliament has decided that this is the case, that the change should be made. The government now wishes to change it back. It will not be cheap, I can assure you of that.
Okay. Well, this is a question, I suppose, that it's legally unsophisticated, but I'm going to ask it anyway. People were interned in the 1970s. There was no trial. There were jury-free trials. This wasn't a normal point in history. Justice wasn't working properly, you could say, at that time. It was what was needed at the time, people would argue. But should we still judge what people are entitled to today with 1970s glasses on?
Well, I actually think you've really got to get into the details, what Parliament said in Hansard, for example, at the time. And I think if you do that, you get a clear path to realising that this judgment is, in fact, probably erratic. But I want to say something. Even if you think internment is wrong, and I know people who think internment was wrong, who still don't believe in what the government is now proposing to do. It's very important to understand that. If you think innocent people were interned, and personally I knew people I think were innocent who were interned at that time, it's still not quite the point. The point now is whether or not in these very difficult circumstances, it is somehow, we have suddenly now discovered in some of these cases, junior ministers signed off on the process, a process which Parliament had fully validated at the time. And Parliament currently also agrees was fully valid.
Right. Just one other question. I'm sure you're expecting this. You're the former chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life. We have had, in the last 24 hours, the resignation of the anti-corruption minister, Tulip Siddiq. The independent advisor on ministerial interests says there was no breach of the ministerial code. I'm sure you've read the letter. Do you agree with that?
Well, I saw the news last night, and I have for a while when those of us who sat on the standard bodies used to meet quite regularly, and I knew Sir Roy Magnus from that time. I know how seriously he will have thought about it. I'm really not inclined, given my respect for him, to second guess him in any way.
He had to do this very quickly, though, didn't he? And people get very agitated by this, and they say, well, we want to know now, we need justice. And so we had 8 days to do it. And in the letter, he kept pointing out, we didn't have the time to get all the documents and all the rest of it. Is that satisfactory, do you think? Just as a general point.
Look, there's a question about inquiries in general. I think in this country, they tend to run on for too long. I think that the judicial process is in itself often over elaborate, and the actual business of preparing reports is not given enough attention to, in creating a kind of a reliable group of people to prepare those reports. I think that particularly I was the historical advisor on the Bloody Sunday Tribunal. And so I'm not going to say that you can't do these things relatively quickly. What's the guarantee the key documents would emerge over the next several weeks?
That's a very fair point. Lord Bute, thank you very much for talking to us. He's a former chairman of the Committee on Standards and Public Life.